When I married Hudson, I thought I'd found my forever. He was charming, supportive, and made me feel like I was the center of his universe. From the moment we met, he had a way of making me feel seen, as if no one else in the room mattered when he was around. Our relationship felt effortless, a kind of love that people write songs and novels about. Every milestone we reached felt like proof that I had chosen the right partner. Hudson was the kind of man who seemed to anticipate my needs before I even voiced them. On rough days, he'd come home with my favorite chocolate or surprise me with takeout from the restaurant I loved. He had a knack for turning mundane moments into something special. A simple walk in the park would somehow become a magical memory. Even my friends envied what we had, often commenting on how lucky I was to have found someone who adored me the way Hudson did. But now, looking back, I wonder if I had been too caught up in the fantasy to see the reality. There were signs, small ones, easily overlooked but significant in hindsight. Like the way Hudson sometimes avoided direct eye contact during serious conversations, or the moments when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. At the time, I chalked it up to stress or fatigue, convincing myself that no relationship was perfect and that these little quirks were just part of his personality. Our wedding day was a culmination of everything I thought our love stood for. Standing at the altar, looking into his eyes, I felt an overwhelming sense of security. It was as if the world could crumble around us, and we'd still be standing strong, hand in hand. The vows we exchanged felt sacred, a promise to be each other's anchor through every storm life might throw at us. Hudson had this way of making promises sound unbreakable, as if he would go to the ends of the earth to keep them. In those early days of marriage, I often marveled at how easy it was to be with him. There was no awkward adjustment period, no feeling of losing my independence. If anything, Hudson made me feel more like myself, like I could be vulnerable without fear of judgment. He was my partner in every sense of the word, sharing in my joys and carrying me through my struggles. But it wasn't long before subtle changes began to surface. They were almost imperceptible at first: missed opportunities for affection, moments when his attention seemed to drift elsewhere. I convinced myself I was imagining it. After all, no one is perfect, and every relationship has its ups and downs. Hudson had always been there for me, so I had no reason to doubt his love. Yet, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was amiss. It was the little things, the way he'd sometimes withdraw into himself after a seemingly normal day, or how his phone would light up with notifications that he was quick to dismiss. I ignored that voice, silencing it with memories of all the times Hudson had shown me how much he cared. I never imagined that the foundation of our love, the trust we built, could be anything less than solid. But as I would soon discover, even the strongest-looking structures can have cracks beneath the surface, hidden until they can no longer be ignored. For now, though, I was blissfully unaware, still wrapped in the illusion of a perfect marriage. Then came Silas, a friend Hudson introduced to me one evening after work. I still remember the first time I met him. Hudson had invited him over for dinner, casually mentioning that they'd met through a mutual acquaintance. Silas walked into our home with an easy confidence, flashing a warm smile that instantly made him likable. He was the kind of person who could hold a conversation with anyone, and it was clear he was comfortable in his own skin. Hudson seemed genuinely excited for me to meet him, and I trusted Hudson's judgment. Silas blended seamlessly into our evening, sharing stories, cracking jokes, and effortlessly becoming part of our dynamic. It was nice, honestly, to see Hudson so relaxed around a friend. He wasn't the type to open up easily to others, so I assumed their bond was something special. Over the next few weeks, Silas became a recurring presence in our lives. He'd drop by for dinner, join us for casual outings, and even started tagging along on our weekend trips. Hudson encouraged it, often suggesting that Silas join us whenever we made plans. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hudson had always been sociable and generous with his friendships, and Silas was undeniably good company. But as time went on, I began to notice little things, subtle interactions that, on their own, might not have meant anything. Silas had a way of looking at me that felt a little too lingering, a little too intense. He was always quick to compliment me, my cooking, my outfit, even the way I laughed. They were harmless words, wrapped in friendly banter, but something about them made my stomach tighten. What struck me most, though, was Hudson's behavior. Instead of showing any signs of discomfort or jealousy, he seemed pleased. There were moments when I'd catch him watching us, his eyes observing, his lips slightly curved into a faint smile. At first, I thought I was overthinking it. After all, Hudson trusted me and I trusted him. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, after Silas had left following another dinner at our home, I brought it up to Hudson. I casually mentioned how often Silas had been around lately, trying to gauge his reaction. Hudson brushed it off with a laugh, saying Silas was just lonely and enjoyed our company. He assured me there was nothing to worry about, and for a while I let myself believe him. But the tension remained. Silas's presence started to feel more intrusive, like he was crossing invisible boundaries neither of us had ever discussed. The way he spoke to me, the way he positioned himself closer than necessary, it all felt deliberate. And yet Hudson never said a word. In fact, he seemed to invite these situations, subtly creating opportunities for Silas and me to be alone together. I started to feel uneasy in my own home, like there was a hidden layer to our interactions that I couldn't fully understand. I found myself second-guessing everything, every glance, every word, every seemingly innocent joke. There were moments when I'd lock eyes with Hudson across the room, hoping to see some kind of reassurance or clarity in his expression. But all I ever got was that same faint smile, as if he knew something I didn't. Looking back, I wish I had trusted my instincts sooner. There were too many signs, too many moments that didn't sit right with me. But I wanted to believe in Hudson, in the love we shared, in the life we had built together. I didn't want to believe that the man I married could be capable of something so calculated, so cold, but the truth was right there in front of me, waiting for the moment I could no longer look away. It happened one night when Hudson asked if Silas could stay over after a late dinner at our place. The evening had been like so many others, wine glasses scattered across the table, soft music playing in the background, and laughter filling the spaces between conversations. Hudson was in an unusually good mood, and Silas, as always, played his role effortlessly. I didn't question it when Hudson suggested Silas crash in our guest room. It seemed harmless enough, and I trusted both of them. As the night wore on, Hudson excused himself earlier than usual, claiming he was tired and had an early meeting the next day. Silas and I remained in the living room, the glow from a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. There was a heavy stillness in the air, a kind of tension I couldn't quite name. Silas leaned back into the couch, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, his gaze lingering on me in a way that felt different, bold, unfiltered. I should have gotten up, made an excuse, and left the room, but I didn't. I sat there, frozen in place as Silas's eyes traced over me, his voice soft as he spoke about how much he admired me, how lucky Hudson was to have someone like me. His words dripped with something more, something dangerous. When he moved closer, there was no hesitation in his actions. His hand brushed against mine, lingering just long enough to make my breath catch. I should have stopped him. I should have stood up and walked away, but instead I stayed. His lips were on mine before I could process what was happening, and in that moment, everything else faded away: the sound of the ticking clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the very weight of my loyalty to Hudson. It wasn't gentle or hesitant, it was intense, electric, and filled with an urgency that felt impossible to resist. Silas's hands explored me without hesitation, pulling me closer, erasing every invisible line that should have kept us apart. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push him away, but my body betrayed me. There was something intoxicating about the way he touched me, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that existed in the world at that moment. But then, in the corner of my eye, something shifted, a faint glimmer of movement from the hallway. I turned my head just enough to see Hudson standing there, partially hidden in the shadows. He wasn't shocked, angry, or hurt. He was watching. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something calculated, something satisfied. Silas noticed him too, but he didn't stop. Neither of us did. It was as if Hudson's presence gave us unspoken permission to continue. That realization hit me harder than anything else. Hudson had seen this coming. No, he had orchestrated it. Every dinner, every lingering glance, every opportunity for Silas and me to be alone, it had all been deliberate. When it was over and the weight of what had just happened crashed over me, I felt sick. Silas slipped away to the guest room without a word, leaving me alone in the dim light of the living room. Hudson stepped out from the shadows, his face still unreadable, his voice low as he said, "You were incredible tonight." The weight of his words crushed me. The betrayal wasn't just in the act itself, but in the realization that Hudson had planned it, that he had enjoyed watching me with another man. My world, my marriage, everything I thought I knew about the man I had vowed to spend my life with, it all shattered in that moment. And as I sat there, trembling and hollow, I realized I could never look at Hudson or myself the same way again. I felt betrayed in ways I couldn't put into words. My husband, the man I vowed to spend my life with, had manipulated me into a scenario I never consented to. The trust I thought we had was gone, replaced by confusion and anger. I spent the rest of that night sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the floor, my thoughts spiraling out of control. Hudson eventually joined me, his face calm, his voice soft as he tried to explain himself. He said it wasn't betrayal, that it was just another way for him to feel close to me, to admire me. He insisted that it wasn't about Silas or even about me crossing a line, but about how the entire experience made him feel more connected to me. His words felt hollow, like a rehearsed script he had prepared for this exact moment. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the way he watched, the way he stood there in the shadows, silently enjoying every moment while I was unknowingly performing for him. I wanted to scream, to hit him, to demand answers that would somehow make sense of it all. But there were no answers that could justify what he had done. Silas avoided me the next morning. He left early, leaving behind only an empty coffee cup on the kitchen counter and a lingering tension in the air. Hudson acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed me on the forehead before heading off to work, leaving me alone in our home that now felt foreign, unfamiliar, and tainted. In the days that followed, Hudson continued to act like everything was fine. He'd chat with me over dinner, ask about my day, and even make plans for us to spend time together. But every time I looked at him, all I could see was the man who had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. I couldn't stop questioning every interaction we'd ever had. Had he been planning this all along? Were there other moments, other people, other scenarios he had set up without my knowledge? I felt trapped. Trapped in my own home, trapped in my marriage, and worst of all, trapped in my own mind. I couldn't shake the guilt I felt for my part in it, even though deep down, I knew I hadn't been the one pulling the strings. Hudson had orchestrated everything, carefully placing each piece on the board and watching it all play out. Yet I was the one left carrying the shame, the disgust, and the unbearable weight of it all. Every time Hudson touched me after that night, I recoiled. His affection felt cold, his love felt performative, and his words felt meaningless. The man I had once trusted with every part of me now felt like a stranger. I started avoiding him, spending hours out of the house, making excuses to sleep on the couch, and keeping conversations short and hollow. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, he asked me if I was okay. His voice was calm, his expression concerned, but it felt like a performance. I couldn't bring myself to answer him. Instead, I stared at my plate, feeling the tears well up in my eyes. The weight of the betrayal sat heavy in every corner of our home. The walls that had once held laughter and love now felt suffocating. Hudson acted like nothing had changed, but everything had. I couldn't unsee his face in the shadows that night, couldn't unhear his words, couldn't forget the feeling of being used, of being reduced to a pawn in his twisted game. I wanted answers, I wanted closure, but most of all, I wanted to escape. Every passing day felt heavier than the last, and I knew deep down that this wasn't something we could fix. Hudson might have been able to compartmentalize what happened, to frame it as something harmless, but I couldn't. The damage was done, and I was the one left picking up the shattered pieces of myself. I couldn't ignore the reality any longer. The facade of a happy marriage was slipping away, and with each passing day, it became more and more impossible to pretend things were okay. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was numb. The person I had trusted, loved, and vowed to share my life with had betrayed me in a way that no words could fully capture. Hudson had opened a door that I could never close again, a door to a reality I couldn't unsee. I tried to focus on the surface, on what was easy, what looked normal. I would go to work, smile when necessary, and make small talk with Hudson when he was around. But underneath all of it, there was a constant ache that never went away. Every time I saw him, every time he touched me, I felt disgusted. I wanted to scream at him, to demand the truth behind his actions, but I was too lost in my own thoughts, too confused to form the right words. The idea of leaving him seemed impossible, yet staying with him felt just as unbearable. I had no idea where to go from here, no idea how to fix what had been broken. Hudson seemed completely oblivious to the war that was waging inside of me. He would continue with his usual routines, always the loving husband, always the supportive partner, but none of it felt real anymore. The love we once shared was gone, replaced by a hollow, mechanical version of the man I had married. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we had ended up here. I kept asking myself the same questions: how had he gotten away with it? Why had he done it? And most painfully, why had I let it happen? The guilt ate at me, gnawing at my insides, despite the fact that I hadn't chosen this path. I hadn't wanted this. But that didn't change the fact that it happened. That Hudson had made it happen, and I had no control over it. I eventually confronted him, but not in the way I had imagined. I didn't shout, didn't demand explanations. Instead, I asked him quietly why. It was the simplest question, but it carried so much weight. I needed to know what was going on inside his mind, what had led him to manipulate me into that moment with Silas. But Hudson, for the first time since all of this started, seemed genuinely confused. He told me it wasn't about Silas, that it was about us, about bringing something new and exciting into our relationship. He claimed it was a form of intimacy he had always fantasized about, and I had been the one to make it real. I felt sick as I listened to his words, his justification. It wasn't about me, about my feelings or my consent. It was about his need to control, to manipulate, to have a secret life that I wasn't a part of. I had been naive, so trusting, so blind to the truth. I had believed in a love that now felt like nothing more than a fantasy, a story he had written to keep me in the dark. The intimacy that I thought was ours had been a lie. The affection, the connection, the love, it was all a performance, something he had carefully staged so he could watch me from the sidelines, as if I were a character in his own twisted version of a relationship. I couldn't stay in this marriage any longer. I couldn't pretend to be happy, to be in love with someone who had shattered everything we had built together. The pain was too much and the betrayal ran too deep. So I made the decision. I told Hudson I was leaving. He didn't fight me, didn't try to stop me. His face was blank, unreadable, as if he knew this moment was inevitable. I had finally seen through the veil he had so carefully crafted, and there was no going back. As I packed my things and walked out the door, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever find the answers I was looking for. But one thing was certain: I would never trust anyone the same way again. And that, I realized, was the true cost of the betrayal.